I think a lot of people use the word spirituality as if it was something that you could either have or not have, be or not be. Sort of like being a fan of a particular sports team. You can kind of decide, okay, I want to do this or I don't want to do this. But what if spirituality is just something that you are, something that describes us as human beings? And we don't really have a choice in the matter. The question is whether we're going to do that well and according to truth and reality or not. Hey everybody, welcome to the Sanctus Forum. I am Michael Stewart Robb, better known as Mike, and this is the channel of the Sanctus Institute, a non-profit institute in Europe with a focus on theology and spirituality, spiritual formation, however you want to call it. We are a non-profit organization, which means we don't have any profit. We depend on volunteers and we depend on donors, and we definitely depend on people that pray for us. If you would like to support what we do, we would gladly receive it. And we still have copies of this as a little gift that we have given to people who have given to us something to say, a bibliography of Dallas Willard. All the recordings and possible writings that you can find about Dallas Willard. If you're a Dallas Willard person, that is a good motivation to give. And if you're not, it doesn't matter. You can still give and you can still help us get the message of theology and spiritual formation out to Europe, churches in Europe, leaders in Europe, so forth. Today we are doing conspiracy commentaries, talking about Dallas Willard's The Divine Conspiracy, and the section for today is called the Substantiality of the Spiritual. Now, substance is one of those words that tends to throw people who haven't studied or done much with philosophy, and yet it is a very important word for Dallas. He does hold to so-called substance theory, and other philosophers don't. So with substantiality of the spiritual, I remember in one lecture he said the problem is not spiritual substance. The problem is actually also material substance. Substances of any kind, it has been very difficult for certain kinds of philosophers to get behind that idea, figure it out. And there's lots of reasons for that. We're not going to go into it, but just a little bit on what substance is, what that means. Now, substance for philosophers comes up in a number of contexts, but there's two that really you can kind of worry about. One is what differentiates one thing from another. So if two things are incredibly alike, so alike as so that everything about them is the same in terms of their properties, you still have two things, and what is it that sort of makes one thing an individual thing and the other thing another individual thing? Substance. Substance is the word that's used. This is often called, thanks to Aristotle, primary substance. It's what individuates something. The second set of issues around which substance becomes important is the question of what unifies something through time or through change. We start to talk about the essence of a thing, the nature of a thing. You start to talk about, well, what is really essential to something and what's something that's accidental. So say for an apple, the color is accidental because, apples can change from red to green or green to red or whatever. But there are other things that are essential, like an apple is edible, and to really take the edibility away from an apple, I don't know, wouldn't be an apple anymore. Now, this set of issues tends to get named, again by Aristotle, as secondary substance. It's when we start to talk about the essence of something, as I said, or its nature. We start to talk about it being a whole and having sort of parts that perhaps you could take off, or then things that you just can't take unless you destroy that particular thing. All right, so substantiality of the spiritual. Let's get into this text here because I think this will help us. You get here a bit of a summary in the second paragraph of what Dallas has been talking about. So he's talking about thoughts, feelings, willings. He says those are dimensions of spiritual substance. They exercise a power outside of the physical. So these are those things that we were talking about 2 videos ago. And then space is occupied by it, and spirit may manifest itself there if it chooses. So that's stuff from way back when we were talking about spirit and space. Okay, now here's where substantiality or substance really kind of comes into play. It's really more the second kind of substance, this sort of secondary substance. And that's because there are a lot of things that are going on in you that aren't exactly the same thing. There are parts, or better, properties to your spiritual nature, to your non-physical nature, which are not the same properties, and they're not properties of your body. Again, I'm sorry for sort of throwing this word property at you, but something like thinking or something like willing, these are not sort of the same thing, and yet they're distinguishable, and yet they're also not properties of their body, they're of your body, they're properties of something else. And what that is you, it's your spirit, it's your invisible side. But there is also this idea of you changing over time. This idea that you are not the same person that you were 10 years ago. You have changed in your character, we usually say, and that's a matter of just what your thoughts and your feelings and your willings tend to be. And that is typical of substances. Substances are the sorts of things that can change over time and yet still remain the same thing. You are the same person, and yet you're different. And the way that works is that your spiritual nature is a substance. Now, there are a few other things going on in this section. One is, I see in the third paragraph here, Dallas is talking about it being for our good to live our lives in interactive dependence upon God and under his kingdom rule. I just want to point out that is a repetition of what he is talking about in the spirit of the disciplines. That is the soteriology of the spirit of the disciplines, and he has kind of summarized it and put it into this book. But go ahead and read that book again, or mark it there that that's what he's kind of referring to. The idea is that being spiritual, we need to draw our sustenance from what also is spiritual, namely God, and the failure to do that is actually a failure of us, and is what results in sin in our lives. So spirit of the disciplines is where that's coming from. And then here's this really interesting thing, which I want to sort of end with. He says, this is how the call to spirituality comes to us. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning, this idea that spirituality is not something that we can sort of choose to do or not to do. It's something that we are, and something that we can only sort of do for good or for worse. And obviously the best way to do it, according to Jesus and his followers, is through dependence on God. God is ultimate spiritual substance. That's actually Dallas that I'm quoting there. And we are sort of dependent spiritual substance, and for that reason, our existence as spiritual beings is dependent on him. Even at the end, he sort of suggests that we need to kind of get used to this, because if we're going to survive life after the death of our bodies, we need to be dependent on something that also is not physical, namely God. It's an interesting way to sort of deal with life after death, and is worthy of some of your thought. Well, thanks for being here, and thanks for listening. Remember, we do have these books available for those who are interested in giving, and please, obviously, you don't need to give in order to get a book, and you can, if you gave last year, you can give again, you can keep giving. It sort of helps us a lot and helps us to reach people here on this continent where you may actually also live with these really, really important ideas. Well, thanks for being here. Bye.